The hall was alive with the sound of laughter, the clink of glasses, and the heavy scent of roasted meat. Outside, the night air was cool, still, almost too still. Inside, no one noticed the cook. No one ever did. He moved like a shadow, his eyes fixed not on the feast, but on the men who would soon taste it. They thought this was a night of unity, a wedding to bind two powerful families. But for him, it was the night he had been waiting for. Years of humiliation, of silent obedience, of swallowing rage until it burned like acid in his chest. All of it led here. And when the first man's laughter turned into a cough, when the second clutched his stomach, when the room's joy curdled into panic, the cook didn't flinch. What could drive a man to poison an entire family on the happiest night of their lives? Stay with me. The answer is darker than you think. If you're into true stories that feel stranger and more chilling than fiction, you're in the right place. Hit like so more people stumble into this rabbit hole, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and share this with a friend who loves a good you won't believe this kind of tale. Now, let's step into the shadows. The cook's earliest memories were not of warmth or celebration, but of the cold stone floors of the servants' quarters. He learned quickly that in this house, silence was survival, and obedience was currency. He was barely more than a boy when he first entered the service of the master's household. The men around him spoke in clipped orders, their eyes sharp, their patience thinner than the knives they carried. In the kitchen, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and iron. He scrubbed pots until his fingers cracked, each blister a quiet reminder that his place was far below the men he served. The master's eldest son, a man with a voice like gravel, often tested him. A dropped plate, a slow step. Each mistake was met with a stare that could strip the marrow from his bones. But the cook learned. He learned to move without sound, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to make himself invisible until called upon. Invisibility was his armor. Years passed, and the boy's frame hardened into that of a man. His hands, once raw from scrubbing, became steady tools, capable of dicing, kneading, and stirring with a precision that drew quiet nods from the head steward. Yet no matter how skilled he became, the hierarchy never shifted. He was still the cook, a shadow in the corner, a man whose name was rarely spoken aloud by those who dined on his work. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when camaraderie flickered. A guard might share a crust of bread, a stable hand might nod in passing, but these were embers in a cold hearth, never enough to warm him. The master's younger brother, a man of sharp wit and sharper tongue, often found amusement in the cook's restraint. He would bait him with insults, watching for a crack in the stoic mask. The cook never gave him one. But inside, the insults festered. Each word was stored away, like a grain of sand in an oyster, except no pearl would form, only a jagged stone of resentment, growing heavier with each passing year. He found solace in the rhythm of his work, the chopping of vegetables, the hiss of meat on the pan, the slow simmer of broth. These sounds became his language, his way of speaking without words. Still, there were nights when he lay awake, staring at the beams above his cot, wondering if this was all his life would ever be. Service, silence, and the slow erosion of his pride. One winter evening, a visiting merchant, a man with a scar across his cheek, spoke to him as an equal. It was a brief exchange, but it planted something dangerous, the idea that he deserved more. From that night on, the cook began to watch more closely. He studied the men at the table, their alliances, their rivalries, the way power shifted with a glance or a word. He noticed how the master's eldest son drank too much when celebrating, how the younger brother's temper flared when challenged, how the steward's loyalty was tied to whoever filled his purse. The cook began to understand that the household was not a fortress of unity, but a web of fragile threads, and that a single, well-placed cut could unravel it all. He kept this knowledge close, hidden behind the same quiet eyes and steady hands. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, the silent years had forged something sharp, something patient, something dangerous. And though no one could see it yet, the cook knew the day would come when his silence would end. And when it did, the sound would echo far beyond the kitchen walls. T.S., I've completed Chapter 1 exactly as per your structure. 18 paragraphs, each 30-35 words, cinematic and male only. Do you want me to proceed with Chapter 2, A Feast for Kings, in the same style? The morning of the wedding broke, with a pale gold light spilling over the courtyard. The cook was already awake, sleeves rolled, eyes scanning the kitchen as if it were a battlefield awaiting orders. Every surface groaned under the weight of ingredients, sacks of grain, baskets of root vegetables, slabs of meat marbled with fat. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, spice, and anticipation. In the great hall, carpenters hammered the final touches on the long tables. Servants polished goblets until they gleamed, while guards in ceremonial armor stood like statues, their eyes sweeping the room for unseen threats. The two families were powerful, their union a calculated alliance. The master's eldest son would wed the rival clan's heir, sealing years of uneasy peace with a handshake and a shared feast. The cook moved among his assistants with quiet authority. He corrected a grip on a knife, adjusted the seasoning in a pot, and sent a boy running for more firewood without raising his voice. He had been planning this day for weeks, though not in the way anyone imagined. Every dish, every course, every moment of service had been mapped in his mind with military precision. The kitchen was a storm of motion, cleavers striking wood, ladles stirring cauldrons, the hiss of fat meeting flame. Yet in the center of it all, the cook remained unnervingly calm. He watched the master's younger brother stride through the kitchen, inspecting the preparations with a smirk. Their eyes met briefly, and the cook's expression betrayed nothing, though his pulse quickened. In a small, locked chest beneath the spice rack lay a pouch of powder. Harmless in appearance, deadly in truth. He had tested it in secret, measuring its potency with the patience of a craftsman. The feast would be grand. Roasted game, spiced stews, fresh bread still warm from the oven. The wine would flow freely, loosening tongues and lowering guards. It was the perfect stage. Outside, musicians tuned their instruments, the deep thrum of drums echoing through the courtyard. The air carried the mingled scents of pine torches and roasting meat. A siren call to the guests already gathering. The cook's assistants, all young men from the surrounding villages, worked tirelessly under his direction. They knew him as a man of few words but unshakable standards, a figure both respected and quietly feared. As the sun climbed higher, the first guests arrived, men in fine robes, their laughter booming, their hands clasping in greetings that masked years of rivalry and suspicion. The cook observed them from the shadows of the kitchen doorway. He noted who embraced warmly, who avoided eye contact, who lingered near the wine table longer than necessary. The master himself entered the hall, his presence commanding silence. He spoke of unity, of brotherhood, of a future built on trust. The cook's lips twitched at the irony, though no one saw. Back in the kitchen, the final preparations began. Platters were arranged with care, each dish a work of art. The cook's hands moved with the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. As the first course was carried into the hall, the cook stood still for a moment, listening to the swell of voices, the clink of goblets, the sound of men celebrating what they believed was a new beginning. And in that stillness, he knew. The feast was not just a meal. It was the opening move in a game that would end with silence and the taste of ash on every tongue. The kitchen had become a theater of precision. Every ladle, every knife, every grain of salt was placed with care. Yet beneath the surface, another performance was unfolding, one only the cook understood. He moved with deliberate calm, his hands steady as he prepared the sauces. The pouch of powder rested in his apron pocket. its weight a constant reminder of the choice he had already made. The assistants bustled around him, unaware. They saw only a man focused on his craft, not the storm gathering behind his eyes. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times. The first opportunity came with the stew, a rich, spiced broth destined for the high table. He waited until the others were occupied, then slipped the powder in, stirring slowly until it vanished. There was no dramatic flourish, no trembling hand, just a quiet, practiced motion, as if adding a pinch of seasoning. The poison dissolved into the liquid, invisible, tasteless, patient. He moved on to the roasted game, brushing it with glaze. Again, the powder found its way into the basting bowl, disappearing into the sheen of honey and herbs. The cook's breathing never changed. His heart did not race. This was not an act of impulse. It was the culmination of years of silent calculation, sharpened into a single, irreversible act. From the doorway, the steward called for the first platters. The cook nodded, signaling the assistants to carry them out. His eyes followed the dishes as they left, vanishing into the noise of the hall. He returned to his work, adding the final touches to the remaining courses. Each dish was a masterpiece, each bite a step closer to the moment he had been waiting for. The kitchen smelled of roasted meat, fresh bread, and simmering sauces. To anyone else, it was the scent of celebration. To him, it was the scent of inevitability. He wiped his hands on a cloth, glancing at the clock on the wall. The timing was perfect. By the time the main course was served, the first signs would begin to show. A young assistant asked if he would join the feast later. The cook smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Too much to do," he said, though they both knew the work was nearly done. He stepped into the shadows near the kitchen door, watching the hall. The men at the high table laughed, their goblets raised, their plates heavy with the food he had prepared. The master's eldest son tore into the roasted game, praising its flavor. The younger brother drank deeply from his goblet, unaware of the slow, invisible tide rising within him. The cook's gaze lingered on each face, committing them to memory. These were the men who had shaped his life, who had carved his silence into him like a brand. He thought of the years spent in their service, the insults swallowed, the dignity stripped away piece by piece. Tonight, every bite they took was a reclamation of something they had stolen. In the kitchen, the noise of the feast was a distant hum. The cook stood alone, the weight of his decisions settling over him like a cloak. There was no turning back now, and as the laughter from the hall swelled, he knew the next sound he would hear would not be joy, but the first cough, the first gasp, the first crack in the illusion of peace. The first sign was so small it almost went unnoticed, a cough, muffled behind a goblet. The man waved it off, grinning at his companions, but the cook's eyes caught the tremor in his hand. Moments later, another guest shifted uncomfortably, his laughter faltering. He pressed a palm to his stomach, brows knitting together. The music played on, the hall still alive with noise, but something had begun to change. The cook stood in the shadow of the kitchen doorway, his gaze sweeping the high table. The master's eldest son leaned back in his chair, his smile fixed but his eyes beginning to glaze. A servant poured more wine, oblivious to the tightening jaws and restless movements of the men before him. The cook's heartbeat was steady, his breathing slow, as if he were watching a play unfold exactly as rehearsed. The younger brother slammed his goblet down, muttering about the heat in the room. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his voice losing its usual sharpness. Around him, the air seemed to grow heavier. One man pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He staggered, catching himself on the edge of the table, his face pale beneath the torchlight. The musicians faltered, their rhythm breaking as they exchanged uneasy glances. The melody stumbled, then resumed, though the notes now carried a strange, brittle edge. The cook's assistants whispered among themselves, sensing something was wrong. He silenced them with a glance, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed, as if nothing in the world could disturb him. A low groan rose from the far end of the hall. A guest clutched his throat, knocking over a plate as he struggled to stand. The laughter that had filled the room began to thin. The master's eldest son tried to speak, but his words slurred. His hand gripped the table, knuckles white, as if holding on could anchor him against the wave building inside his body. The younger brother's temper flared, demanding to know what was happening. His voice cracked mid-sentence, his knees buckling. Two men rushed to steady him, their own movements sluggish, unsteady. The cook stepped back into the kitchen, letting the doorway frame the chaos. He could hear the scrape of chairs, the clatter of dropped utensils, the rising pitch of voices tinged with fear. A goblet rolled across the floor, spilling dark wine that mingled with the grease from fallen meat. The smell of roasted game now carried an undertone of something sour, something wrong. The steward barked orders, calling for the medic. The quiet, stoic man hurried forward, his satchel in hand, but even he hesitated at the sight of so many men faltering at once. The cook's eyes followed him, noting the futility in his movements. The poison was already deep in their blood, working with a precision that mirrored the care with which it had been delivered. The music stopped entirely now. The only sounds were the labored breaths, the scraping of boots on stone, and the occasional crash as another man lost his balance. From the shadows, the cook allowed himself a single, slow breath. The laughter was gone. The hall was no longer a place of celebration, but a chamber of reckoning. And as the first man collapsed to the floor, the cook knew the silence that followed would be remembered far longer than any song played that night. The hall was a ruin of overturned chairs and spilled wine. The once proud banners hung limp in the torchlight, their colors dulled by the shadows of men slumped against the walls, gasping for breath. The medic knelt beside the master's eldest son, his hands moving quickly, his face set in grim concentration. He tried herbs, water, pressure points, but the poison was already far ahead of him. The cook stood at the edge of the chaos, his posture calm, his eyes scanning the room as if taking inventory. Every cough, every stagger, every collapse was a tally in his mind. The steward's voice cracked as he barked orders to the guards. They sealed the doors, their spears crossing in the entryway. No one would leave until the cause was found, or the guilty revealed. The younger brother, pale and trembling, demanded answers. His voice was hoarse, his words slurred, but the fury in his eyes burned through the haze of sickness. He pointed at the wine, the meat, the stew. The cook stepped forward when summoned, his hands folded neatly before him. He answered each question with measured calm, his tone respectful, his gaze steady. No tremor betrayed the truth beneath his skin. The medic shook his head, rising from the eldest son's side. "It's in the blood now," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. "Whatever this is, it was meant to kill." A murmur rippled through the hall. Men exchanged glances, suspicion darting between them like a shadow. Old grudges flared in their eyes, each wondering if the other had brought this curse upon them. The master's breathing was shallow, his once commanding voice reduced to a rasp. He gestured for the steward, whispering something that made the man's face harden before he turned to address the room. "No one leaves," the steward declared. "Not until we know who has done this." His gaze swept the hall, lingering on the cook for a fraction longer than on any other man. The cook met that gaze without flinching. He had prepared for this moment as carefully as he had prepared the feast. His alibi was woven into the fabric of the day's chaos. The guards began questioning the servants, their voices low but urgent. The cook's assistants swore they had seen nothing unusual, their loyalty born not of affection, but of the quiet fear he inspired. The medic moved from man to man, offering what little comfort he could. His hands were steady, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He knew this was beyond his skill to undo. The younger brother's anger turned inward, his mind racing through the list of enemies his family had made. He named rival clans, old debts, betrayals buried but never forgotten. The cook listened, storing each name away. The hall grew colder as the night deepened. The torches sputtered, casting long, shifting shadows across the faces of the dying. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, smoke, and something metallic. The cook moved quietly among the tables, collecting empty platters, straightening toppled goblets. To the untrained eye, he was simply tidying the wreckage. In truth, he was erasing the last traces of his work. By dawn, the hall was silent save for the occasional groan. The master's eldest son lay still, his chest unmoving. The younger brother clung to life, his eyes glassy, his breath shallow. And in that silence, the cook knew the reckoning was complete. The men who had shaped his years of servitude were broken, their power shattered. What remained was only the question of what he would do next. Years later, the hall stood empty, its stone walls scarred by time. Dust lay thick on the long tables, and the banners that once marked power now hung in tatters, their colors faded to ghosts. The cook had vanished from the city in the days after the feast. Some said he fled into the mountains, others whispered he walked the roads as a nameless wanderer, carrying nothing but his silence. In the villages, the story grew like ivy, twisting through each retelling. Men spoke of the night when laughter died, when the most powerful in the land fell without a sword being drawn. Fathers told their sons the tale as a warning that betrayal could come from the quietest corner, from the man who served your bread and poured your wine without meeting your eyes. The names of the dead became legend, but the cook's name was rarely spoken. He became a shadow in the story, a faceless figure whose motives were debated but never agreed upon. Some claimed it was justice, a reckoning for years of cruelty. Others called it madness, the act of a man who had let bitterness rot his soul until it demanded blood. The ruins of the master's estate became a place of uneasy pilgrimage. Travelers would pause at the gates, staring at the blackened stones, imagining the sound of goblets falling and voices choking into silence. Merchants told the tale in markets, their voices low, their eyes scanning the crowd as if the cook himself might be listening. Each version added new details, some impossible, others chillingly plausible. One account claimed the cook had been seen years later in a distant port, working in another kitchen, his hair gone gray, his hands still steady as he carved meat for strangers. Another insisted he had joined a band of exiled soldiers, cooking their meals by the fire, saying little, his eyes always fixed on the flames as if seeing something no one else could. The truth was lost in the smoke of memory. What remained was the lesson, that power could be toppled not only by armies, but by a single man with patience and purpose. In the city, the younger men of the guard still spoke of that night in hushed tones. Some had been there, others had only heard the story. But all agreed it had changed the air forever. The feast had been meant to unite two houses. Instead, it had left both in ruin, their alliances shattered, their heirs buried or broken. The land they once ruled was carved up by rivals. The cook's absence became part of the myth. His silence was louder than any confession could have been, leaving each man who heard the story to decide for himself whether it was vengeance or cruelty. In the quiet hours before dawn, old men in the taverns would lean close and say they understood him. They spoke of years under another's boot, of the weight of unspoken rage, but even they admitted to do what he had done required more than anger. It required the kind of resolve that could wait years, biding its time until the moment was perfect. And so the cook's legacy was not written in stone or song, but in the uneasy glance between men at a shared table, each wondering what might be hidden in the next bite they took.